Welcome back to Inclusion Revolution. I'm Tova Sherman, your host here on Eastlink, and of course our guest is Krista Daley, the CEO and Executive Director of the Nova Scotia Human Rights Commission. When we broke, Krista, we were talking about dollar amounts, and I think I might have jumped a little too quickly on that. Could you please clarify what it may not be a maximum, but more like the understood, like make that clear, because I just threw 10,000 out like it was firm and cement.
Yeah, and I think that's a good thing. There's nothing that in our legislation that limits the amount of money, and I say that simply because other legislation would say people can never get more damage than X dollar a figure. So we don't have that in Nova Scotia, but the trend still tends to be the $10,000 in what I call the general damages, the pain and suffering, the discrimination damages tends to be around 10,000, but that doesn't mean in an individual case, given what the person went through, that it wouldn't or couldn't be higher.
In other words, it's not in cement, it just seems to be a working loose number that some people look at, but by no means is it firm.
No, exactly.
And I just want to make that clear because listeners are going 10,000, so that's it, and I just wanted to be sure we were clear on that. Yeah. So let's say against all odds, because you're doing such a great job, against all odds the mediation just doesn't work.
Yes, the mediation doesn't work.
It's been 9 months, everybody's done what they can, they came together in what we thought was the best headspace possible, like you talked about, and it's now been 10 months, everyone's frustrated, it didn't work out. Where do we go from here? And where, more importantly for me, does the client or the person who made the complaint go from here? Yeah,
what happens at that point is the whole file gets assigned then to an investigator, who then does up a very, very formalized complaint form, and the employer then gets to respond back in writing, and you call it a rebuttal or a response, and then the investigator starts the interviews. And they go out, they go to the workplace, they start to interview everybody, they take in the documentation, and that can take, depending on people's availability, etc., that can take about a year to sort of get all of that
so now we're into a year later after the mediation,
at which point they make a recommendation to the commissioners. And there are 12 commissioners from across the province, whether or not something should go to a board of inquiry.
So this is a review panel determining whether or not the board of inquiry gets it.
Exactly.
Okay, I got it.
And then it goes to a board of inquiry, at which point that would probably take about another year. That's an open process. It's a public process. There would be a hearing, and if
throughout that year, these things would be happening.
Yeah, and it starts to look a lot more like a court and a hearing and a public process. And
not nearly as amicable as potentially mediation could have been.
That's right. Starts to get a lot more legalistic looking, a lot more formalistic. For some people that's a fine process, for other people that's not a fine process, and it really depends in part, I suspect, on people's personalities type. Like some people may like or feel comfortable in the more public display of their personal details,
whereas others would be absolutely mortified.
Yeah, exactly. And so a lot of that, I think, goes into people's response at a mediation stage. What are their interests in getting the whole thing settled early? Some of it could be a very personal comfort level as well.
Something I've always done, Krista, forgive me, with all my clients who have an issue with someone before I even send them to you, and that is to ask them what they want. Exactly. In other words, to take a second, and this is everybody who has a complaint. I always say take a moment and write the top 4 things you want. Absolutely. Sometimes it's them to be trained, sometimes somebody to be fired, sometimes it's money, sometimes it's just to give me that window seat, you know what I mean? Yeah. But then I ask them to prioritize them in order, meaning which is really the most important, and it's very telling because sometimes it's surprising, sometimes it's revenge.
Yeah, it can be a simple.
But what about that person who doesn't like the public? She's still working for this employer. We're now in year 2 of the eye issue, the visual issue and equality issue. We've not made it through mediation successfully. Is she still working there? I mean, I have to say it that way, like she could be, but it's a little amazing to me personally. Maybe I'd be a little intimidated to be working in a process where I'm really up against the boss in what now is quite a formal process.
Yeah, I would say in most cases the person would no longer be working, but we certainly have seen it. And in one sense, you really have to hand it to both of the two parties in that sense, that they are able to sort of distance the issue from the people. The day-to-day people. The other thing, though, and I think your viewers need to know this, is that there really is also a law against retaliation. So right in our law, if an employer then ever attempts to retaliate, So let's say, once again, in your model, they're still debating about the window seat for the visually impaired, yet at the same time, they're perhaps denying the person travel benefits or other things.
They're squeezing them a little.
They're squeezing them a bit. Then you're into an issue of retaliation.
And you
can
have
file
the
a separate complaint on retaliation. And so I would say the norm would be they no longer are in a day-to-day working relationship.
And that makes some sense to me, quite frankly. I'm not sure I could handle being there every day under
but
the
we do see
circumstances.
the opposite, at which point it's an interesting type of a process at that point, because really then the people are really just arguing about this almost technical legal issue.
And the fact they can do
and
that
yet it's
is
not
kind of impressive.
Exactly. It is.
I hear you.
At that point, it's not a personal issue anymore. It really is just, we can't afford to give you that accommodation.
Right.
We still want you to be our employee. We just can't afford whatever
It's amazing
it is.
if they can, and I give them credit if they can. I guess for me, what's most interesting about what I've learned from you today is that there's a much more short-term to a long-term process. There's a lot of opportunity. There's a lot of expertise to draw on. And I'm really pleased to hear how holistic you're trying to keep and create an environment at the Nova Scotia Human Rights Commission, and for that I congratulate you, because I know there's been some positive changes in your presence, and I won't go into them, but I'm certainly pleased. Now, I don't have a lot of time, so I'm going to rush into my little probe, my news, and this is from the Ottawa Citizen. And a leading mental expert says that depression among Canada's public servants is the country's biggest public health crisis. In the public service, mental health claims have doubled between 91 and 2007, and now account for 45% of all claims. So with that in mind, if you've ever gone through human rights mediation, did you find it helpful? Let us know on our poll on inclusionrevolution.com. For me, Tova Sherman, that's all the time we have today. Thank you, Krista Daley. Thank you all for viewing. We'll see you every Sunday and every Monday to Friday, so come visit us on Eastlink. See you then.